Hello from the National Archives Public Programs and Education staff. My name is Sarah Lyons Davis, and I'm an education specialist at the National Archives in New York City. Welcome to the National Archives Comes Alive Young Learners program. Today we meet Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was an American journalist who made a name for herself by going undercover. One time, she went undercover to report on mental health treatment in an asylum, and her reporting helped lead to better conditions for patients. While she held many jobs in her lifetime, she became best known for her attempt to go around the world in 80 days, inspired by Jules Verne's popular novel of the day. Nellie Bly is portrayed by Ava Prickman from History at Play. The National Archives has many records related to everyday activities, public institutions, journalism, and workers' rights. We have this photograph of Nellie Bly, which is part of the general historical and promotional records found in the Department of the Treasury. William Gormley made the coat and the dress. The dress includes camel hair for warmth, as Bly was concerned about having clothing sturdy enough and adaptable to various climates. The U.S. Treasury Department used this photograph in an advertising campaign to help to promote the purchase of savings bonds. The advertisement reads, "Phileas Fogg meet Nellie Bly. Engine 93 streaked through Arizona, its 8 steel wheels flailing down the track. And when the young lady at the controls thought the engineer wasn't looking, she opened the throttle another notch. She was Nellie Bly, reporter for the New York World, and she was in a big hurry to reach Jersey City and beat a fictional man in a trip around the globe. The man's name was Phileas Fogg, phlegmatic English hero of the popular novel by M. Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. And beat him she did." The advertisement goes on to tell us that Nellie Bly and her trip captured the authentic American spirit that translates dreams into practical realities. It reminds Americans that you can save money when you buy U.S. savings bonds via your bank. U.S. savings bonds were ways to lend the U.S. government money, and in turn, the government agrees to pay you back with interest. Today's program is brought to you from the National Archives Public Programs and Education team and the National Archives Foundation. You can find information for free teacher and student programs on the National Archives website, archives.gov, and under Archives News, upcoming events, and if you follow the National Archives on social media. For today's program, imagine we're just a few days before Christmas 1889, and the well-known and plucky female journalist Nellie Bly is 39 days into her famous trip around the world. She plans to complete her journey in 75 days, an accomplishment which no one knows if she can achieve. But having just arrived in British Hong Kong, she learns that not only is she frantically racing against time, but she's also racing against another previously unknown female reporter. Yet, despite these pressures, Nellie has generously agreed to grant a one-of-a-kind interview to her admiring fans. Let us now meet Nellie Bly.
Welcome to all of you. I am so pleased that you are here. I do love to meet with travelers who are interested in my trip and to tell them all about it whenever I can. I do hope you've made yourselves comfortable. Yes? Can I get you anything? Tea, perhaps? No? Well, I cannot guarantee that I will be very good entertainment, as I have been entertaining people all afternoon, and I have only just arrived in British Hong Kong at 7 a.m. this morning. What brings all of you to Hong Kong? Business? Ah, yes, a lot of business is done here, indeed. Oh, do be careful of the monkey. I bought him in Singapore. Simply could not resist. Now, I have smothered the impulse to buy many other things which would only hinder my travel. But when I saw that monkey, all of my resolve melted. What's that? Oh, no, 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 no. He is not dangerous. The man who sold him to me said he wasn't. Monkey, no bite. Those were his exact words. Although, the way the man was holding the monkey, he couldn't possibly have bitten, even if he'd wanted to. Well, I've just come from Singapore, although I didn't stay there long. You see, I don't have time to stay long anywhere. I am going around the world, going to do it in 75 days or less. And if I can, it will be the fastest that the trip has ever been done before. And now, right now, I have been traveling for 39 days. And I just arrived in British Hong Kong at 7 a.m. this morning, like I mentioned, but I am not looking forward to my stay here. It is the last place on earth I would choose to spend the 1889 Christmas holidays, but journalism does not accommodate comfort. I've learned that many times before. And I shall have to stay here a whole 5 days before I can catch the steamer for Japan. 5 days of doing nothing. Or at least going nowhere. And all the while... Well, you see, when I first arrived here at 7 a.m. this morning, like I mentioned, I went straight away to the shipping offices of the Oriental and Occidental Shipping Company to see when the first steamer for Japan would leave. And I was met by an agent who inquired after my name, which I promptly told him was Nellie Bly. Oh, no, it's not my real name. No woman would write for a newspaper under her real name. It is considered too dangerous, as those who are opposed to her work, or even opposed to the idea of a woman writing professionally, might stalk her or track her. Anyway, this agent ushered me back into a private room and, sitting down, quietly informed me that I was not only racing against time, but another woman. Miss Elizabeth Bisland is her name, and she's working for the Cosmopolitan, a newspaper based in New York City like my newspaper. She plans to do the trip in only 70 days, and she went west around the world instead of east like I did, presumably because she believes the winds and the weather will be more favorable in that direction at this time of year. And she left Hong Kong here 3 days ago. I mean to say, here I am, 39 days into my trip, and not a single word from my editor on the subject. My trip is the most highly publicized story that my newspaper has printed in the last year. Every sentence of every telegraph which I send back to them is printed in the morning's papers and then reprinted in countless papers all over America. My newspaper has even printed a board game based on my travels, which readers can snip out of their edition and play on their kitchen tables. They're holding a competition to the reader who can guess to the nearest second my total time when I return to New York. You would think, with all of this publicity, that my editor, Mr. John Cockerill, or at the very least my publisher, Mr. Joseph Pulitzer, would have the courtesy to send me a line every once in a while to tell me that some other woman has decided to mimic my trip. But I'm not racing. If someone else wants to do the trip in less time, that is their concern. I promised my editor at the New York World that I would do the trip in 75 days or less, and if I can, that will be enough. Here I am, grumbling on about my own personal problems. You've come to hear interesting details about my trip. It goes to show that I have not had a decent night's sleep in several weeks. Well, let me see what I can tell you. Well, the great travel innovations have been a wonderful aid to my journey. And I believe, well, the Suez Canal was my personal favorite. And now, as of course you all know, the canal was built just 23 years ago and is located at the top of the Red Sea. Now, before the canal was built, travelers had to either sail all of the way around the tip of Africa to reach the east, or travel all of the way across India. But now, they can sail straight down the Red Sea itself, saving them countless days of wearisome travel. Now, all of the ships must move very slowly through the canal so that the movement of the waters caused by the ships does not make the loose sands on either side of the canal sink into it and make it narrower. So it would be a terrible thing for a ship to get stuck in the canal, as so much of the world's economy and transportation now relies upon it. Now, I would not have minded the slow movement had it not been for the fact that the sun, reflecting off the walls of the canal, made the heat oppressive. There was nothing I could do, as I did not have room in my bag for a change of clothes, so I had to suffer in silence. Oh, but it was not an easy thing to pack, however, as I knew I could only take a single bag. Yet I did manage to fit into it. Allow me to show you. My underclothes, I won't show you those. What else? Hats, plenty of these, excellent for keeping the sun off one's face as much as possible when sailing through places like the Suez Canal. Handkerchiefs, multiples of these, they get dirty surprisingly quickly. Notebooks. Now, I am planning to write a book when I return to the United States, all about my travels and what I've seen. So I'm trying to note down the places I visit, the people I meet, the foods I eat, all of my opinions, so that others can read about it when I return. And, of course, to go with that, many pens. These break surprisingly easily. What else? And a jar of cold cream. Of all the things. Now, when I was packing my bag, despite all the other necessities, which I knew I would have to bring, this jar of cold cream would find its way into a corner, no matter how hard I tried to keep it out. It is excellent for keeping one's complexion clean and fair, despite all the various climates I have been traveling through. What's that? Why all this bother over my luggage? Well, let me tell you all about it. When I first proposed the idea of going around the world to my editor, he did not at all approve of it. He told me that, well, it would be impossible to send a woman because she would need so many trunks and hat boxes, and, well, a chaperone would have to be provided. If anyone was going to do the trip, and they had thought about it, it would be a man. I was affronted and greatly angered. Now, I know well enough that women of any respectability and means expect to travel with several trunks and hat boxes. But if one is traveling simply for the sake of traveling and not for the purpose of impressing one's fellow passengers, the problem of baggage becomes a very simple one. And a chaperone? I have been all over the city of New York, and never once have I needed a chaperone. I am well able to take care of myself. So, I looked him squarely in the eye and said, "Start the man. And I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him." Well, I can assure you that by the time I left his office that day, I had been promised that if anyone was going to do the trip, it would be me. I always say that energy, rightly applied and directed, can accomplish anything. And if I can complete my trip around the world in 75 days or less, I will break all previous records and become the first woman in a list of men to complete a record for circumnavigation. Oh, but this is not my first dangerous undertaking, let me assure you. Of course, you all know of the time I was committed to an insane asylum for 10 days. No? You have never heard of that story? Well, let me tell you all about it. You see, when I was first applying to my editor for the job I now hold, he was not at all keen on the idea of hiring a female reporter. But he gave me a challenge. He said, well, if you can get yourself committed to the Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum for Women in New York, you can have the job. Well, you must understand that that very morning, my purse, which contained all the small savings I had in the world, had just been stolen from me on a public bus. I was without money, I was without a job, I was all alone in the great city of New York. I had no option but to accept his challenge. So I said I would. I could. And I did. Now, I will admit that I had not the faintest idea how an insane person acts, aside from characters I'd read about in serialized novels. Oh, I don't know, something about staring eyes and a wild look. I would not allow myself to sleep a wink that night, and I read ghost stories to sufficiently scare myself. I practiced making horrible faces in front of the mirror. In the morning, I engaged a room at a home for young women, where I once more refused to eat and refused to sleep, and repeated over and over and over and over again that I had lost my baggage. I did, on several occasions, have a great deal of difficulty to keep myself from laughing at the frightened and astonished looks on the faces of the women around me. By the time I was committed to the asylum, and I was successfully committed, I had convinced several women and policemen, one judge, and 4 doctors that I was completely insane. But when I reached the asylum, there was no time for pride at my accomplishments. Some of the women who were there, they were no more insane than I. Others were immigrants who could not speak a word of English to convince the authorities of their sanity. And I will have you know that from the moment I entered the asylum, I acted like myself, without any hint of pretended insanity. Yet the more I tried to convince the authorities to let me leave, the more they refused to let me go. Each morning, after eating a breakfast that was scarcely fit for the dogs on the streets of New York, we were made to sit in 2 facing lines. We could not move. We could not talk. We could not eat. We could not sleep. Hour after hour, we sat like that. What? Accepting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment. Here is a class of women sent to be cured. I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit on straight back benches from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. at night. Do not allow her to talk or to move during these hours. Give her no food, or give her bad food. Give her no reading. Let her know nothing of the outside world and its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and a physical wreck. I was released from the asylum 10 days later, and shortly after my reports, which detailed the atrocities I had witnessed, were published, I was asked to testify in front of a grand jury as to what I had seen. I gladly did so. I even accompanied them to the asylum itself so that they could see at first hand the horrors I had witnessed. But it seems that our coming was reported to the nurses, for the conditions were greatly improved. I have one consolation from my work, that on the strength of my story, the Committee of Appropriation provides $1 million more than was ever before given for the care of the insane. So, my friends, do you think I need worry about a Miss Elizabeth Bisland? If I can live in a madhouse for 10 days, I can go around the world in 75. I always have a comfortable feeling that nothing is impossible if one only applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction. And I've never lacked energy, or dedication, or persistence, or conviction. So, my dear friends, wish me luck, and I will see all of you in New York.
Thank you so much for sharing those incredible stories about your experiences.
It was my pleasure.
I would love to ask a few more questions.
Please do. I'd love to answer questions.
Wonderful. How did you get to where you are as one of the country's most famous investigative reporters?
That is an excellent question. Now, I have worked for 2 newspapers so far in my career. First, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and now, of course, the New York World. When I was 20 years old, I came across a column piece that was published in the Pittsburgh Dispatch entitled, "What Girls Are Good For." This piece suggested that girls and women are good for nothing but bearing children and taking care of the home. I was so outraged that anyone could write such a piece that I wrote a scathing letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Dispatch expressing my disgust at this piece. And he was so impressed by my writing that he offered me a job on the staff of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. I was excited. This was the first opportunity for me to get to do something professionally, something useful in the world. But I was assigned to the women's pages, all about society, fashion. Mrs. So-and-so's last soiree. You cannot imagine anything more dull and insipid for an energetic young woman like myself than writing the women's pages. So after several months working for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, I grew dissatisfied with my assignments, if you can even call them that. So I moved to the great city of New York. Now, New York City is the center of journalism in America. Park Avenue has even been renamed Newspaper Row because so many publications have their offices there. Now, I spent 4 months, 4 months looking for a place to work. I went to dozens of newspapers, and they all told me the same thing. They said, well, female journalists are too much bother. Well, you can't send them out on their own. Goodness, no. And you don't need a whole flock of them writing the women's pages. I was told this over and over and over again. So as I said, 4 months later, my purse was stolen from me on a public bus. I marched up to the offices of the New York World. I was fed up. I confronted the boy at the door, and I demanded to be admitted. And I must have intimidated the poor thing because he let me in to see the editor himself. And of course, he offered me, or rather challenged me, to the Asylum job. And after that, I became known for my undercover stunt work, either interviewing famous people. My name, my pen name, Nellie Bly, is often featured in the headlines of the stories, which is extremely rare for a woman. So my persona, so to speak, has become part of what has made me famous, me the person, rather than just what I write about.
How interesting. And you mentioned briefly about hearing about someone else trying to set a record over your trip. Are there others trying to set travel records?
Oh, yes, as I mentioned, with all of the innovations and the revolutions in transportation and technology, travelers are simply itching to press the boundaries of what is possible. And now, I don't know how widely this is known, but I have heard that several other men proposed this same trip to my editor at the New York World and offered themselves as the travelers. Now, one of those men was a man by the name of Henry C. Jarrett, and he was by no means unqualified to do the trip. You see, in 1876, after the Transcontinental Railroad, which spans the United States from the Atlantic all of the way to the Pacific, was completed, Mr. Jarrett and his theater troupe, of all things, traveled across the country by train, arriving on the West Coast in just 83 hours. That's 3.5 days. That's a record-breaking time. It was so fast that the newspapers called it the Lightning Express. So I've heard of Mr. Jarrett's trip, and of course he gallantly backed down to allow me to do this trip. And I have heard rumors that someone by the name of Annie Londonderry is considering circling the world, like myself, but on her bicycle, of all things. So, as I mentioned, with greater connections between cities and ports, faster transportation, it's inevitable that people are considering trying to break new records, or rather set new records, and test the limits of what may be possible.
Well, what an exciting time. Could you tell us some more about your pen name?
Oh, yes. No, there's a great story behind that. So, as I mentioned, many writers, female writers in particular, use a pen name. Sometimes that's as simple as just the initials of the writer, but more often, especially when women are concerned, it's some creative play on words, alliteration, some clever twist of phrase or turn of phrase. So, my editor, my first editor from the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and I were sitting in his office attempting to find some suitable pen name. And we've been sitting there for quite some time, brainstorming lists and lists and lists of things, when all of a sudden, a newspaper boy walked outside the office, down the hallway, whistling a tune. It was the popular minstrel tune written by our great American composer, Stephen Foster, by the name of Nellie Bly. So that became my name. We immediately were like, yes, that's the one. And an interesting thing, the name in the song is spelled Nelly, but due to a printing error, I became Nellie, and I've been so ever since. So if you ever write me a letter or have any cause to write down my name, you must spell it correctly.
Thank you. And in your work as Nellie Bly, have you met any famous people?
Oh, yes, in my trip especially, I have met so many wonderful people who've helped me on my way and wished me well. Now, if I had to play favorites and pick just one, I believe I would pick Monsieur Jules Verne and his wife. Now, As you may have guessed, it was Jules Verne's famous work Around the World in 80 Days, which is the premise of my trip. Now, in the book, for those of you who've not had the pleasure of reading it, and if you have not, I highly suggest you do. It's quite entertaining. It's a lovely way to spend an afternoon. In the book, Monsieur Verne sends his hero, Phileas Fogg, around the world because of a bet that he can do it in under 80 days. And Jules Verne was inspired by reality when he was writing his book. He consulted timetables to see what might be possible, and he came up with 80 days as the potential time that it would take to circumnavigate the globe. Which is where this, well, I should say that in the book, Mr. Fogg, the hero, goes on many side adventures and gets caught up in all sorts of things and bribes his way out of uncomfortable situations. So there's still been this feeling, well, is it indeed possible to circle the globe in 80 days or less? So I had not originally intended on visiting the Vernes, but when I arrived in Southampton, England, after crossing the Atlantic, that was the first stage of my trip, I was told that Monsieur Verne had expressed a desire to meet me, and that if I hurried, I would have time to accept his invitation. Well, you can imagine I did not hesitate to agree to such a delightful detour. I spent a delightful evening in their company, despite the fact that I cannot speak a word of French. Oh, and I must tell you one more thing. Now, Monsieur Verne showed me his study, and in the hall outside of his study, there was a huge map of the world which was hung upon the wall. And he told me that when he was writing his book 19 years ago, he had mapped out Phileas Fogg, his character, he'd mapped out his trip on the map so that he could see where it would all be and keep it in his mind. And now my route differs slightly from Mr. Fogg's in that I have just traveled around the tip of India, while Mr. Fogg traveled across India. And so, while we were standing there, Monsieur Verne marked out my own route on his map. It was a thrilling moment.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. Were you an adventurous child?
Oh, well, I grew up in a family of 14 children. My father had several children by his first wife, and then about four more by his mother, his second wife, or excuse me, his second wife, who was my mother. And so I was an aunt that had nieces and nephews that were several years older than myself. So I grew up surrounded by children. I like to say, or rather boast, I should probably say, that I have never had to see a doctor once in my life. I've been extremely healthy and rambunctious ever since I can remember. So growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, surrounded by countless children of my own age or older or younger, I was inevitably engaged in hijinks. And my mother used to call me Pinky because she would always dress me up in pink, but that never stopped me. I would run around and all of my friends called me Pinky as my nickname.
That's wonderful. So I know that you have limited time with us today, but I do have one final question.
Please.
What advice do you have for young people today?
That is a wonderful question. Now, I've said multiple times as I've been talking with you that nothing is impossible if one only applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction. And I believe that to be true. People will tell you that you can follow your dreams if you only believe in them, and that certainly is the case. But believing is only the first step. If you put in the hard work, if you apply yourself, and you dedicate your energy to doing something that may seem impossible, nothing is out of your reach.
Such great advice. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and sharing these incredible stories and background.
It has been my pleasure, and I do hope to see all of you waiting on the train station when I return to New York.
And now one last look at the journalist and adventurer Nellie Bly. And I hope you can join next month for our Young Learners program with Thomas Jefferson, founding father, main author of the Declaration of Independence, diplomat, lawyer, philosopher, and third president of the United States.